I was pastoring in a mega church, kind of a Willow Creek model. I was abused by a leader. That abuse and manipulation and actually physical aggression towards me triggered a existential crisis. I didn't know how to be connected to the church. I didn't know how. I mean, the thing I loved the most hurt me the most. And so I loved ministry, and that was the actual weapon that injured me. And I didn't really know how to relate with it any longer.
Well, welcome to the Liminal Living podcast. And boy, I've got a great treat for you today. Today we're talking with Dan White Jr. And Dan he's like Mr. Rogers as a church planter. And I know a lot of you don't have the imagination to wrap your brain around that just yet, but after hearing him today, I think you're going to understand it. He's just done, his resume is huge. We go over that in the intro. But what really captures my attention about Dan is just his gentle soul. He has the gift of healing, like as hospitality. When you enter into Dan's space, you know you're safe. And he has like this healthy boundary of who he is and who you are and what those expectations are. And today we dive into kind of leadership in the helps ministry, pastoring, counseling, all that kind of stuff, and the ego and skimming the ego, cracking the ego. We're getting into Howard Thurman's concept, Carl Jung. I mean, like, we do a deep dive into the ego, and it's not as brainiac as you think, because he tells it in narrative form. He shows us his story. He's just a great soul, a great human, and I believe you're going to absolutely love Dan and his work. And you can find all of Dan's stuff, Dan White Jr., all one word, .com. You can go check out his webpage, buy his books, and all that kind of stuff there. So without further ado, here's Dan. Well, today, welcome to the Liminal Living podcast. We have a wonderful man, a gentle soul, Dan White Jr. today. Dan has like this gift of healing, and I'm not talking about just Pentecostal throw hands on you and you're walking again kind of a thing, but like he's just a gentle soul. He's got like this slow, he's like Mr. Rogers as a church planter, and he's just an amazing guy. He's got an amazing resume as well. He's a church planting strategist with the V3 movement, co-founder of the Praxis Gathering, which they're meeting again in Chicago pretty soon, author of 4 books, pastoring and church planting for 20 plus years. And now he has co-founded and he is building up with his wife Tonya the Kineo Renewal and Retreat Center down there in Puerto Rico from like the ground up, like literally rebuilding this thing. He is remodeling every room, tile by tile, space by space. And he has his wonderful story. He's a wonderful soul, and he is a practitioner of liminal spaces. He might not use that language, but he does so with pastors and people in the helping community that need help. So Dan, thank you so much for being on the Liminal Living podcast, and welcome.
Love it, Tom. Glad to be here. I love the title of your podcast.
What strikes you about that title? It's kind of a interesting academic phrase that I've co-opted for myself.
Yeah, well, I guess most people would see liminal space as something to get rid of and to get out of as fast as possible. And I love the living. It's learning to live into it.
Yeah.
Rather than to eradicate it or be in denial. Yeah, it's kind of a conjunction of two words that don't seem to be together often. So, like it.
Yeah, at first I had liminal leadership back in the day when I started to think about this thing, but then I was going to get sued by a lawyer who like actually trademarked that name and came after
me. Oh, really?
Cease and desist.
Of course.
So I was like, I got really nervous there for a moment. I'm just trying to start something off the ground, and here I get this cease and desist letter, and so then Yeah. Then my wife said, liminal living is way better than liminal leadership, you know. I was like,
It actually is. Yeah.
this is where we live. Yeah. So, yeah, I got to meet you we've been friends on Facebook, connected for years now since your work on the V3 movement. But I got to meet you in person down in Puerto Rico for a retreat just this past March. And
Yeah.
I got to tell you the story. Like, I live in Michigan and it's March, and I got a plane taking off out of Grand Rapids at, I think it was 6 a.m. So I wake up at 3, I got everything packed, I'm ready to go. I open my door, there's a blizzard, there's a snowstorm, and I didn't know it was coming. I get in my car, and I'm driving through a blizzard to get to the airport, and I cannot see 25 feet in front of my car.
Yeah.
I like this semi passed me, and then the visibility went down. I almost went off the road. It took me an extra half hour to get to the airport. It was white knuckling the whole way. And then being a 6'5" man, in coach on these planes, I'm like jammed on this plane for a couple hours. And then I finally get to the retreat center, and your arms just shoot open wide, and you're like, Tom, it's so good to see you. I'm so glad you're here. And you gave me this big hug. And that was my first meeting with you. And that's why I picked that. You're a gentle soul with this gift of healing. Like, my anxiety started to drop at that moment. I'm like, this is a safe space.
Good.
So,
well, you got here hell or high water, and you deserve some more.
I was say hell and high water, because Lord have mercy.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering, like, if you could just kind of give us like a little bit of a picture of kind of your faith paradigm that you grew up in. Like, what's the soil are you coming out of?
Yeah. The short of it would be that I was raised in an independent Baptist church, in a really low income trailer park culture.
I got you.
And I was a bit always at odds with some of the environment I was raised in. And at 16, I had this is maybe your listeners will know this person, but I met Rich Mullins.
Rich Mullins, back in the day. At 16, you met Rich Mullins?
I did, and I met him, and I met him at a festival, and when I met him, I was struggling a lot with my faith. I think it was probably at a point of, I probably wouldn't have called it that back then, but I was deconstructing some things, sitting in liminal space, wondering if there was a place for me, and all of it, and faith, and I had it coming. Actually, it was coming off of an argument with our pastor, and I'm not much of an arguer, but we kind of had this kind of exchange in the hallway that was the collision of my opinion and his opinion, and it felt good. And so I met Rich Mullins at this festival, and I asked him if we could. He was just did a little set, and there was probably only like 100 people in his tent. And I came up to him after, and I said, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" And he stopped everything, and there was like a line of people there, and he said, "Sure, let's go sit down." And which was, part of the story is the power of that moment is that he was utterly present to me, And we sat down on this little stump of a tree that had probably been cut down at some point. There's a stump there, and we sat down. And he said, "What's up?" And I said, I don't know if I want to be a Christian anymore. And I just gushed all my struggles and questions and frustrations, and he just listened. And then, like, I chewed his ear off. I know I did. He didn't say words for like 20 minutes. I was that kid back then, just like working it out verbally. And he said at the end of that, he said, "What's your name?" I said, "My name's Dan." He's like, "Dan, if you strip it all away and all you're left with is Jesus, you're going to be okay." And I said, "Huh? I can do that?" He said, "You're going to be okay if everything goes away and you're left with Jesus." And that was the first time I had ever heard of that narrative or concept or like possibility, that I didn't have to have a gazillion doctrines and dogmas and stuff cluttering and packing up everything, the corneas, and I could simplify. Felt really, really odd to me. I never heard anybody speak that way. And then the permission that he gave me, and said, "I'm going to be okay." Because I think underneath the surface, I was really afraid. And that triggered that was the start of a movement towards Anabaptism. I didn't know at the time, but just like focusing on the words, works, and ways of Jesus, putting in some sense putting the Old Testament in its place, and allowing the preeminence of the person of Christ to be the beauty and the interpretive factor on all of the scripture, and then actually the model for living. That whole journey, that shift, pulled me away from my Baptist roots and into a more ragamuffin, simplistic, lots of space for questions, but also a radiance of the person of Jesus. And so that was a 5 or 6 year journey to the point where I was able to have some confidence in what I actually believed again, and what was I rallying around, and what was my my compass in the world. And even though in my upbringing Jesus was in the mix in there somewhere, he was just one of many many ingredients, and he really wasn't the filtering factor. And so it took me a while to skim and cut and slash and declutter to get to that point. So that's those are my early roots.
So it sounds like Rich gave you like that permissive space to explore and to question, and I guess to own it. Like this, you were handed something, early on. Here's the questions, here's the answers, here's the verses that hold them all up, and that caused like existential angst inside of you, wrestling.
Totally.
And then Rich,
that's it.
Go. He
gave me permission, and I didn't. I think, which we all go through this in a little space. There's a moment where we have some realization where I'm like, I don't think I know what I know, or maybe I don't know myself as well as I thought I knew myself, or what I think I know was just given to me, and it hasn't really moved inward. It's just been everybody else's tools or stuff. And Rich gave me some bravery to own that journey rather than just wear everybody else's clothes. And so
It's a good picture.
I thought that was like, to do that, I mean, this is my adolescent mind, like to do that meant a death sentence for my faith. I thought it meant immorality, like I was going to go off the deep end and just trash myself. I mean, I had all these looming monsters that I was afraid of. And when he said those simple words, like, it's okay. It's going to be okay. I was like, are you sure? Really? That's not what everyone else is telling me. And I don't think I'm telling myself that. So, yeah, it was a powerful pivot.
So
in my life.
There's like this verse coming to mind where Paul is talking to, writing to Timothy, and he's saying, not to take advantage of the gift that you received when I laid my hands on you. I'm wondering, like, did Rich Mullins pass that gentle, permissive spirit onto you, and now you have the Kineo Institute, and Rich Mullins' spirit is like living on in what you do at Kineo? That's just really interesting. He passed the gift to you.
Yeah, there's something there, Tom. I do think the story arc of our lives, we don't really like ever, the parts of pain and the parts of like these significant shifts are always in some sense repurposed in the future. Like they become, they express and they show themselves, and they actually create formation in the future that we didn't even have an imagination for. And so I think that space making, that place to come to terms with our true and false self, and our doubts and our questions and our anger and our shame and our fear, all that, Rich embodied that at that moment. And so many ways, that's good. That's encouraging. Gosh, now I wish I could share that with him, but he's passed away. So thank you for that.
So you ended up entering the ministry. Like what was the journey from that point to entering into like a pastoral role of some kind?
Yeah, I think that, connecting it to that moment, that was that attentiveness and that compassion and that invitation into Jesus was like marked me so significantly that everything else felt a bit kind of secondary. And so my call in the ministry was like, I want to do something with this. And I don't know what it means. I don't know like what place there is for helping people with compassion, see themselves, see God, feel loved, feel included, and even be gently challenged. I didn't know what that looked like. And so that was the beginning of like, I want to do something with this. So, somewhere in there around 20 or 21, I sensed that I wanted to enter into what many would consider professional vocational ministry. And that took on its own journey as well, what that actually means and all the different ways that it, I lived into that, but that was the beginning. So I studied, went to seminary, went to Bible college, in order to get equipped. I don't know if I was equipped well in those environments. I mean, it was certainly a space of learning, but the equipping part of like the interface of pain and people and contextualization and the complexity of questions. That wasn't part of the training.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
Which is important. And that was certainly, I'm grateful for some of that. But the things that actually ended up being the burnout and really the blunt force of ministry wasn't really theological. It was relational, and I don't know if I knew how to do that part so well.
Yeah. It's like seminary gives you the ideas of faith, and,
Yes.
and then when you have a lived experience, like they don't necessarily teach you how to build the bridge between like theology and lived experience, and a lot of deconstruction and liminal spaces and angst, existential. Like it comes from not knowing how to build the bridge between what I'm experiencing in my body and what I know in my brain, or have been taught in my brain. And those, and then you get into a pastoral role and you're like the keeper of the ideas and the dispenser of the ideas. And it almost becomes like an ideal, like it's like like a thing that's there that everyone should be living into and up to. But then you put it like on the ground with messy relationships and emotions and psychology and ego and all this stuff.
Oh yeah.
I don't even know how this idea works here. And so what I have done in the past as an unexperienced, unformed pastor would just be to write them off as wrong. And I'm right because I'm the pastor with the best ideas.
I get it. Yeah.
And it just doesn't, that doesn't hold water, because you do a lot of harm with that. And I think seminary doesn't teach us.
Yes.
So how long were you in pastoral ministry before you started to feel the effects of like burning out and fizzling up and getting tired?
Yeah, I've had two moments where I would say I hit a wall that was, impenetrable. Like I couldn't scale it or dig underneath it. It was a wall physically, mentally, emotionally. And the first one was I was pastoring in a mega church, kind of a Willow Creek model. I think we were actually a Willow Creek Association church, and this is now, it must have been like, early 30s, late 28, 29, 30, 31, somewhere in that range. It's all a little bit blurry, the exact date, but I was in that environment, and I was abused by a leader, and that abuse and manipulation and actually physical aggression towards me triggered a existential crisis. I didn't know how to be connected to the church. I didn't know how. My call, the thing I loved the most, hurt me the most, and so I loved ministry, and that was the actual weapon that injured me, and I didn't really know how to relate with it any longer. And I went, and I had a very fruitful ministry up to that point, but that wall I hit there was like, it's like a car crash. It stopped everything. And then you're picking through the damage and the collateral. And I went on a 18-month wilderness, not literal, but figuratively wilderness season of saying screw the church and screw God on some things, and what's wrong with me and what's wrong with everyone else. I was flailing, and I was in the wilderness, just in many ways kind of licking my own wounds and depressed. I was clinically depressed, and not actually for quite a while in those 18 months, not even interested in any light. I was just in reaction to the wounds and to the reality that I slammed into, that people hurt people. Part of me, before that, I would have been able to say, yeah, I know that's true, but there was an idealism in me that was just like, Yeah, but not me. And that's for everyone else. So when my idealism was crushed, I rocked bottomed out into pessimism, and it was a scary time for my family and my wife. They didn't know where I was or whether I was going to come out of it. I was an insomniac in this season. I was hospitalized. People will worry about me, and and it really was all physical manifestations to this deeply unanswered question of like, why did this happen to me? And I don't think I can survive past this point. I don't know how to be me past this point. And so that internal struggle was going on then. So that was the first one. And I see now how that was actually super formative and transformative. I think that's the first time I looked at my own ego genuinely. Even though the harm was done against me, it did begin to open up an exploration into the real me and myself and my ego and my angers and my shame and my fear and my posturing, posing, and pretending, and I didn't really look closely at that until that I hit that wall, and so it triggered that aspect of my. Yeah, I think it moved me from the external life into the internal life, and I would not have asked for it. Like that's not. I'm not saying, it's a good thing that happened to me, but I do see now it was the pivot point for me to look and walk down a path that I would not have wanted to walk down. I mean, it's the concept of like, you don't mess with a good thing. Like, listen, when things are humming and you're fruitful and people are affirming you and you're celebrated and you feel like, why am I going to look at the foundation? It's all good. And that's how I felt about my life up to that point. I don't really need to look that much deeper because look at all the external. That's pretty good. That moment called that all into question. So
you used posturing, pretending, and posing. That I mean, that's like a well-done author right there, or preacher. What is that? Like 3 things that sum up what you mean when you refer to the ego?
Yeah, the persona is kind of the summation of those things. Like that's like the catch-all for me. Like I had put on a persona that was a symbiotic partnership between what the environment wanted from me and what actually affirmed me. So I was celebrated for the persona that I put on. It is like a great unhealthy marriage. And so some of the posturing that would get me love and acceptance and 5 stars and a salary increase and a job. Pretending, yeah. So for me, pretending was a lot of pretending that I didn't have feelings. A lot of denial, a lot of stuffing. And, I have a significant fear issue, but if you would have asked me if I was afraid, I'd say no. I lived in many ways pretending that I didn't have a body, that I didn't have, that you couldn't hurt me, that I wasn't hurt, that I wasn't exhausted, that I was putting on a lot of, and so that's all related to the persona, which was, this is what people need from me. This is what's expected from my environment. And I think this is what gets me low. I think this is what I'm good at, what people like about me. and I'm competent. Like I've been able to figure out how to be excellent and significant with those things. So it all seemed to work. But the persona is you don't really come to terms with that persona until you fail, burnout. Something has to crack that glaze, and so that's what happened for me.
So that first abusive situation, that first burnout, kind of like you're beginning to look inward and question your presentation of yourself to the world. Is this really me?
Yes.
And
yes, exactly.
What, I guess you said there's a second one that you went through again. Did that deepen this moment, or did it like solidify it further?
Sure. Yeah. Then the second one was 7 years ago, which was the catalyst for, ultimately, I didn't know it at the time, it ended up was the catalyst for starting Kineo. But so the first one was a lot of, I was that liminal spaces had a lot to do with image management and how I presented myself to others, and the performative aspect of, and the disintegrity between my performance and my inner life. The second one was really catalyzed by inadequacy, and the inadequacy relationally to be carry the burdens of other people. I was under, in some ways, I would say a delusion that I could be that for you. You were hurting, I could be there for you. And if there was brokenness, I could be a soothing balm. Now that sounds quite beautiful, right, to say that. But I was under delusion that I could be that for everyone. And in that I had poor boundaries, and a blurring between where I started and where people started and where I ended. It was quite a bit of a blur. And for up to that point, before that burnout, I was in a really, really experimental, I think quite beautiful expression of the church. But there was a lot of conflict. And not even with me. When you bring people who have been traumatized by Christendom and are not healed themselves, they can injure others unintentionally by flailing. Think of it as like you're out in the ocean and you'll grab onto, and you're drowning, you'll grab anything. You'll claw someone's eyes out if you could hold on to them so you don't sink. And so the environment became, in some ways, unlivable for me and a few of us. We were just collecting so much need. And we delusionally felt we could be the hero, and we could take the hits. We could be the absorbent for you. And ultimately, my body broke down physically. My body broke down. I have a strong will, so it takes me a while to realize I keep telling I'm tenacious. I'm resilient. And then my body gave out, and it started giving out slowly. I started having panic attacks. And I made light of them, like, I put myself back together. I had a panic attack right before I was leading a community-wide discussion. I had this horrible panic attack, And like I picked myself up off the floor and straightened myself out and went back and went into the room and led it. And people were like, it was an amazing event, you know. Little did they know is that I was had a meltdown 20 minutes earlier, 15 minutes earlier, and I had those signs, but ultimately showed up. I ended up having an uncontrollable shake in my hands and in my throat, and that wouldn't go away. And you know, I saw a neurologist, I saw a primary care physician, it was psychologists, and ultimately that they prescribed or described that I had CPTSD, and that I had some complex trauma, cumulative trauma that my body was storing. And though my mind felt strong and I felt passionate and focused and you know, like my body was saying, you're done. And there was a divorce between how I was internalizing pain, rejection, abandonment, loss, grief, loneliness. I couldn't pretend any longer that I was okay. And so that was 7 years ago. That was the beginning. That was it's a second layer. Mm-hmm. So maybe in some ways it's a second layer moving past the persona or dealing with another layer of the persona that I had carried. So I was in the environment that I was in, the MO, which sounded so like I was so proud of it, but now I look at it and I can see, was like, hey, you got a problem? Are you struggling? You got to go to Dan. Anybody hurting, hemorrhaging, emotionally, physically, spiritually, go to Dan. You got to go to Dan. And I said yes. And I absorbed a lot in that role, and eventually it caught up with me. So,
man, I remember hearing your story at one of the sessions that we had at the retreat in March, and I had done a lot of, having the master's and doctorate in formation. You have to delve into a lot of the inner life, a lot of the even like psychological aspects of things. But you mentioned like this skimming of the ego that can happen when you encounter severe suffering. So, because one of the questions someone asked me was, so you say suffering can lead to transformation, but suffering can also lead to like someone being very unhealthy and a horrible person.
Oh yeah.
And then you mentioned this skimming the ego, and like lights were turning on for me, like, maybe not all suffering brings us there, or we're not willing to. What can you kind of tell us of this concept of the skimming the ego?
Yeah, it's on there. I mean, that's it right there, is that suffering does not automatically equate transformation and health. I mean, if we're really honest, it often leads towards bitterness, resentment. And anger is not necessarily sin, and it's not wrong, but like you can live in anger the rest of your life, in defensiveness. So self-protection, it can draw you into the deeper into those unhealthy parts of your life, which scripturally we call that old creation. Like I could lick old creation for the rest of my life, because I'm entitled to, and I'm justified to. I know there's that part of me that's like, people hurt me, so I hate all freaking people. I mean, that's that's the place that my old creation wants to live, and then elevate an arrogance in that, like I'm better than everyone else. So skimming the ego is some of this is innovated off of Howard Thurman's work, Jesus and the Disinherited, but it's not from that book, but some of his self-care literature for civil rights leaders. But he talks about skimming the ego and just kind of, or cracking the ego, like going, which just sounds violent, but it's going deep downward rather than just kind of, when you skip a stone, you skim off the surface. And the skimming the ego is the temptation, which is, oh, I just need a little rest. I need a vacation. Maybe I need a couple better habits. But the deep pulsing inner life is avoided. But we tell ourselves that we're doing that inner work because we are doing some skimming. And that's partly what denial is, or deflection, or taking a detour around facing yourself and your history and what hurts and how you respond to hurt in unhealthy ways. And so that that experience 7 years ago really was like, Dan, you can't skim the ego any longer. You cannot. You have to deal with why you want to be people's hero. Like why you are clawing and clinging to being people's hero. I didn't want to face that part of my life and look at what was broken there, what was hurting there. Some of it comes from my mother and father wounds. Some of it comes from the environments I was in. Some of it comes from, I like being the hero. Like I love it. And so there's an attraction to that. And I didn't really want to look at that because in many ways I was still I was blaming. I was like, it's everyone else's fault. Everyone else did this to me. And so that kept me for a little season just kind of skimming off the surface. It wasn't until I realized that God didn't want to hurt me and ruin me. And this is typically what prevents us from moving into cracking the ego or moving downward into the ego is we're afraid of being hurt even more, or we're afraid of who will I be if I go there? There's a sense of deep fear that God wants to hurt me, or it's not safe. So I had to deal with that, and that began a whole journey of exploring, why I showed up in ministry certain ways and abandonment in ministry. Like, you've had this, I'm sure we all have, like people you trust and deeply love. You would have potentially given your life to them, suddenly are gone, and you feel abandoned and left alone. And how that actually that was a trigger for me in many ways from my past and my adolescence, and dealing with loneliness and being rejected and being abandoned, and left to take care of my own wounds. And so, I was reliving some of that in my ministry, those wounds. And so I didn't really want to interrogate that because I was afraid of what I met. So the difference between skimming and cracking, I hope I was able to identify that a little bit.
Yeah.
Skimming is a coping mechanism. It's and it's natural. It's actually I have a lot of grace for it because, if you probably know this, but like, you get a cut and then it gets infected a little bit. And then you come to me and I say, if we're going to heal this, we're going to have to dig into it a little bit and clean out that wound. You're like, that feels worse than where I'm at now. Yeah. And so, I watch this with my kids. There's a part of us that is coping, like protecting still. and doesn't want to be hurt even more. And so it's counterintuitive to move towards a deeper work in your ego than it is to embrace skimming.
Yeah, definitely can see that. And someone might say that they don't have an ego problem because they're not like, this arrogant, confident person out there, but they might be like super insecure. But I'm kind of seeing like ego is like this polarity of arrogance and insecurity, but we recognize it more in the arrogance mode, like, oh, that guy's got an inflated ego. But then the person sitting in the corner, they're just afraid to put themselves out there. They're really insecure, easily offended. That's also an ego. Have you seen this polarity of arrogance and insecurity as an ego thing?
Yeah, I mean, Tom, the arrogance piece is the one that's probably more gross to us. Mm-hmm. So it's easy for us to say, "Oh, that person's an egomaniac," right? And I've been under that leadership, so I know that piece. But the ego is according to Carl Jung, there's 5 foundational ego needs, like the needs, how we form the self, our sense of self, who we think we are to others, who we think we are to ourselves, what works in the environments that we're in for us to be accepted and fruitful. We form this self-constructed ego based on 5 different needs. And for all of us, 1 or 2 of them are broken at some point. There's belonging, there's safety, there's significance, there's agency, and there's understanding. And based upon whatever foundation has been broken for us, we act out in certain ways. So for me, early on, safety was broken for me. I was bullied intensely for 5 straight years. I came home, my dad told me I wasn't tough enough. I needed to learn how to fight. And I still got the crap kicked out of me even more when I went back and fought. And I realized, I picked up over time, no one will take care of me. You are on your own. Do not come home and let your dad see that you're beat up. What that looked like behaviorally was hiding and insecurity and retreat and disappearing and detaching. No one would ever have said Dan is powering up and Dan is abusing power. I was literally a coward. And that's how I interacted with all things that threatened me, that communicated to me that something could hurt me. So that's the way that I dealt with that broken cinder block being broken at an early age. And then it showed up in ministry. And so ego can be cracked in different ways. Our ego, we all have an ego. It's just cracked in different ways. And then the work is to see how now we are living from that broken part of our ego that's cracked. In many ways, rehearsing and reliving still how to prevent that from being injured again. And that's where bad behavior comes from. When you're compensating for something that you're protecting, you end up overcompensating. And that's what I did. And so significance, that brick, if that one's cracked, that's where you see arrogance and like some of the obnoxious expressions of personality when it comes to needing to be seen and celebrated and affirmed and needing to be in the limelight, talking about yourself all the time when significance is broken. So I actually just had a leader here last week who was raised in an environment where mom and dad told him all the time, communicated constantly that his worth was completely dependent upon how much he achieved. And he would get kudos and love and celebration and like energy, whatever he achieved. So when he entered into ministry, and within 7 or 8 years, his congregation was not responding to him well. He wasn't achieving. It's actually, 2 stars out of 5. he did not know how to be. He did not know how to exist because his entire ego was built upon significance. And so what he ended up doing was trying even harder to prove and show that he was spectacular and worthwhile. And that's because that he hadn't dealt with that being broken. And so I think there's a lot of grace for exploring why we overcompensate and why our ego shows up certain ways. It's typically rooted in something that was tender and vulnerable and injured, and we thought we moved on from it, but it's still pulsing under the surface. So yeah, I don't know if that helps answer that. The arrogant in there.
It's which of the 5 foundations have been negatively affected, then kind of shows how it displays itself later on in ego management. That is helpful.
Totally.
Yeah. Now,
yes.
Here's kind of here's a deeper question. It's my final question.
Okay.
But I think this one, I want to hear your take on it. When you've been broken and you've done the inner work, you've looked the ego in the face, and then you recover like yourself, you still have to go back to living in a world full of broken egos, inflated egos, with systemic scaffolding that holds up and rewards that.
Yes.
How does one survive the liminal space of such a world?
Yeah. That's a hard question, Tom.
It's the question, I think.
I mean, that's the question of the hour: is how do we live into this new creation, this true self, when the world doesn't affirm that? I mean, people fall in love with the false self. I have a friend that actually a board member for Kineo that says, he says it jokingly, but he says, I got hired for my false self. People hired the false self.
Yeah.
And then when I started to move into the true self, they're like, what? You tricked us?
Mm-hmm. That's
not what we love about you.
Exactly.
So there is this tension of entering the orbit of life and what is affirmed, what keeps our job, what gets us more money, what has gotten us status in an environment. For me, I've had to accept disappointing people. That's hard. That's hard for me, really hard for me. But
yeah,
like I've actually had to own and say, I cannot be what you want me to be. I know that you have projected expectations on me. I know that this would get me an opportunity, but I cannot be that. That's not who I am. And this is a differentiation a bit, is like, what is my identity and what does this environment need? And realizing I'm not those pieces. Now I could become a chameleon and take them on in order to fit this environment or to grow this environment, but I'd have to lose myself to do that. And so better boundaries, better differentiation, better owning the reality of letting people down. That would have panicked me years ago, literally created a bodily meltdown, the thought of choosing to disappoint people.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean from the pulpit with preaching. I mean my network of people, disappointing them because I'm choosing to show up differently. I think that's for a lot of leaders who are 2, 3s, and 4s in the Enneagram, the shame triad. Many of them are outrunning disappointment. I'm not in that triad, but I still struggle with trying to run as fast as I can from letting people down. And that often prevents us from actually moving to towards that transformed sense of identity and who we are, who we're not. So, I mean, I guess my short answer is we have to grow our muscles for disappointing people, and then realizing I'm still loved, I'm still okay. Though you might be communicating disappointment, dissatisfaction, I'm not who you want me to be. One schema that's helped me quite a bit actually is Dan Allender, and he talks about three. This is like family systems theory, but it's helping me a lot to realize what's going on with people and me. Is people have typically choose three options when they can't have you the way they want you. So if I can't have Tom the way I want Tom to be for me, they typically choose three options. They reject you, they ghost you, I'm done with you. Or they ruin you. They say, if I can't have you this way, then I have to ruin your reputation. I have to tarnish you. The third one is the healthy one, and they receive you as you are. Ooh, I'm getting a rainstorm here.
Oh, I mean, that happens in the rainforest.
It does. Or they receive you as you are. And I've learned to accept that some people along the journey don't know how to receive me as I am. Their own unhealed foundations, their reactions are, I have to ruin you or reject you. They haven't yet moved towards receiving people on the terms of how people are rather than on what they want them to be for them. And so that's helped me a lot, kind of accept that. I mean, I think even in my own past, I know, and I've actually said sorry to a few, I have actually rejected people for not being what Dan White Jr. wanted them to be. I wanted them to be a version of myself, or I wanted them to meet a certain need that they couldn't meet. And so I said, I pitched them. Not even overtly, but like kind of covertly. And so we all have these tendencies of doing that, and that's helped me quite a bit as well. So
those three things, that is helpful. And then I had, in my doctorate degree, one of my teachers was a psychologist, and he said the thing that changed him was saying, I'm not responsible for people, I'm responsible to people.
That's big.
And I will show up for you.
Yes.
I will be me for you, but I'm not responsible for how you receive that.
That's great.
But that's hard, because if you haven't done the ego work, you want to pretend and be the superhero and play the game and
yes. Yeah. I think the journey of every leader is like, because the roles that, I mean, I don't mean just ministry worker, but like even social good workers and nonprofit, anybody doing compassion work, deep work with other people, you do internalize those expectations. So you start to, the expectations from without, you end up actually thinking they're yours for yourself. You lose contact with who you really are because you're internalizing everything from everybody else.
Yeah.
What often happens is at some point in life, you hit a wall and someone goes, none of this, I don't like any of this stuff. None of this is me. And I don't know why there's a anger and frustration that you've given so much of yourself away, but you don't even know what self is. So that's something that's work I've had to do, is like when I'm internalizing someone's like, that's exactly what it is. I can show up for you, but I can't take ownership of you. And so, that is a hard moment. It's a hard thing to start tuning into when you're drifting in that direction.
Yeah. Well, Dan, this has been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate you giving me some time. I love the view behind you, the rainforest. I remember that room. It's some fond memories. I can't wait to be back in that room and you making me a mojito with some rum and some pineapple again. And that's going to be, that'll be great. But thank you so much for just sharing your wisdom and your heart and everything. It's been awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, man. It's good to talk about things that matter. So appreciate you hosting this space.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Liminal Living podcast. That was such a fun conversation. Dan is he's intelligent on a soul level, not just a brainiac level. He's got that too, don't get me wrong, but he's just so soulfully intelligent, and those conversations are ones I love to have. So I very much enjoyed my conversation with Dan. I hope you did as well. If you could do me a favor, if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. It helps people find us wherever you're listening, whether it's on Apple or Spotify or Amazon or I don't know where else you go to, but wherever you are, rate, review, subscribe, help people find it. If you really like this episode, share it on your socials, and we'd love to, you can help us out that way. So we'll see you next week. We have some more conversations up and coming. So peace out, my friends.